This video goes through two examples of factoring quadratics where the lead coefficient in front of the x squared term, is not 1. So there are many different ways you can factor quadratics. There are lots of different methods, one being guess and check, which I know is common, but this is a trick. Okay, so this is not algebraically sound, as I've said before in class, but it will get you the correct factors when your lead coefficient, again, is not 1. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. First, you take that coefficient that's in front of the x squared, and you're actually going to multiply it by the last term, the constant term. In this case, that's 8. And when you multiply it, we're actually going to move it over here so that it's not in front of the x squared term anymore. So now the problem is going to read x squared minus 10x plus 24, okay? And now we're going to factor this quadratic, which is a little easier to work with because, again, it doesn't have now a lead coefficient that's not 1, okay? So when we factor it, we're going to try and find two numbers that multiply to be positive 24 that are going to combine or add to be negative 10. So if two numbers are multiplying to be a positive and adding to be a negative, then they both must be negative numbers. So in our parentheses, we can put x minus for the first one and x minus. Okay, so you can think through the factors of 24. There's 8 and 3. There's 12 and 2. Okay, there's 6 and 4. But you have to pick the pair that when you add them together, okay, because we're going to be adding two negative numbers, so adding them together, you're going to get negative 10. Okay, so technically I could put negatives in front of all of these. Okay, so you might be thinking 12 and 2, because 12 minus 2 would be 10, or I should say 2 minus 12 would be negative 10, but that doesn't work because you're making one of the numbers positive and one negative. If both of the numbers are negative, then it's negative 6 and negative 4. So that's what goes in our parentheses, minus 6 and minus 4. But that is not your answer. Remember, when we started, I moved this 3 over and I multiplied it by 8. So I now have to counteract that. So I'm going to take my two factors that I found here, the factors of 24, and I'm going to divide them by 3, because the way I got 24 was to multiply by 3. And then you have to reduce, okay? If you can't reduce, like I cannot reduce this 4/3 in the second parentheses, if you can't reduce, then you're going to scoot that number back up in front of the x term. If you can reduce, then you'll just do your reducing. Sometimes you reduce the fraction and you still have to scoot a number back here, but you always have to reduce the fractions if possible. So when I reduce, I get x minus 2, because 6 divided by 3 is 2, and then 4/3 cannot be reduced any further, so I scoot the 3 back and it's 3x minus 4. And those are the correct factors for the quadratic that we started with, so that's your answer. Again, this is as far as you can go, because I did not give you an equation. So this didn't say equals 0 or anything like that. So do not reply that the x values are 2 and 4/3. This is in fact your final answer. Remember, you can always check that your answer is correct in the end by expanding it back out. So I could double distribute this right here. I could distribute in the x to both parentheses, some of you have learned this as FOIL, and I could distribute the negative 2 back into the parentheses, and I should end up with this original equation if I've factored correctly. So some of you have been wondering if you're correct or not at the end, but you can actually check yourself and see if you're correct. Okay, so if I were to multiply this back together, I would get 3x squared for my first term. My second term would be negative 4x. My third term would be, if I distribute now the negative 2 in, that would be negative 6x. And my final term would be positive 8. Sorry to be squishing it over here. And that is going to be what I started with once I combine my two inner terms. This is 3x squared minus 10x plus 8, which is what I started with. So now you know your answer is correct, so you can always check yourself at the end. Let's look at a second example. If you don't need a second example, you can pause or stop the video at this time. So in this example, again, my lead coefficient, the coefficient in front of the x squared term, is not 1, it's 6. And so I could factor this by guessing and checking, or whatever other methods you're used to. There's the box method and whatnot. But here I'm going to show you the trick again. So the very first step is that I'm going to take that 6 and I'm going to move it over here by multiplying. Just don't forget to counteract that at the end by dividing. So when I multiply, I get x squared minus 7x minus 18. Okay, and now we're going to factor this quadratic right here. And that's a little easier to work with, again, because now the lead coefficient is 1. So in my parentheses, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to be a negative. So now one of the signs must be positive, and one of the signs must be negative, because that's the only way you can get a negative number. So the two numbers are going to multiply to be negative 18, and they're going to combine to be negative 7. So again, if you think through the factors of 18, you could choose 18 and 1, or 6 and 3, or 9 and 2. And 9 and 2 are the ones that are going to work here. Again, I want this to be a negative 7 when I combine the two different terms. So in order to get these two numbers to combine to be negative 7, then I must have a negative 9 and a positive 2. So that's what's going in parentheses. Put the 2 with the positive and the 9 with the negative. So here's our factored equation, but don't forget, I multiplied by 6 up at the beginning, so I'm going to now divide by 6. I chose this example because I'm going to have to reduce both of these fractions and scoot numbers back. So first I'm going to reduce. So if I look at the first part here, 2/6, that will reduce down to 1/3. So I have x plus 1/3. And in the second parenthesis, I have x minus, and 9/6 reduces down to 3/2. Okay, now since I've reduced and I still have a fraction, I need to scoot that 3 back over, and I need to scoot that 2 back over. So my final answer to factoring this quadratic is 3x plus 1 in the first factor, and 2x minus 3 as the second factor. And I know people have been asking this in class, but the order in which you place the two sets of parentheses does not matter. So the same answer would be 2x minus 3 times 3x plus 1. That's the same exact thing. However, some other people asked if you could flip-flop the signs. No, I can't have 3x minus 1 and 2x plus 3. That will not give me the correct factors or answer. In fact, it will give me a positive 7x up here if I flip those signs. Okay, so your final answer is either one of these. They are identical. I hope this helped. If you have more questions, you can email me.